This is the Psychology to Live By podcast, where we discover how to live life a little better. Welcome to Psychology to Live By. In this roundtable today, I'm joined by my very knowledgeable and insightful friends from Network Music. Terry McBride, Chairman and CEO, Colleen Novak, Artist Manager, Chris Norwood, Chief Strategy Officer, and Karen Mix, Director, People and Operations. And we're discussing artist, composer and record producer Robert Koch, who is much better known by his stage name, Robot Koch. Originally from Germany, at the age of 13, he was inspired by MTV videos and embarked on his musical career. Now residing in Los Angeles, Robert has a stellar background in composing and producing his own work, as well as for other major artists. Our topics, as usual, were creativity in music and their relation to mental health, with a focus on what challenges our well-being and creativity, and what Robert has found that nurtures his creativity as well as his physical and mental well-being. This conversation was very uplifting, very stimulating and rich in insights. And topics that we touched on included the toll that touring took on him physically and psychologically, and that led to his decision to follow his passion, trust his intuition and stop touring. Artist sensitivity as a superpower, the relationship between intuition and a sense of coherence, meditation and accessing intuition and creativity, egolessness and the problems of the ego, healthy perfectionism and intrinsic motivation, and being comfortable with the unknown, and other topics. So it was a lot, really. But with no further ado, let's talk with my friends from Network Music and let's see what they took from this conversation with Robert. Hello, my friends. I just better bring that screen up. Yes, I can see you now. How are we all? You all well?
Doing well.
You look well. Yeah, look at all those smiles on the dials, as we say here. So, who would like to kick off to talk about what struck them with this conversation with Robert?
I don't mind.
Okay, wonderful.
Well, like you were saying, Dr. Chris, at the off, that I was like all over the place. Like I wrote down body-mind connection, imposter syndrome, psychosocial stressors, but meditation, the egolessness. I was like, oh my God, where do we go with this? But So this is going to be a really broad question. But so my takeaway, I hope this doesn't sound negative. The uncertainty in choosing to be an artist as a vocation creates or can create anxiety exacerbated by those psychosocial stressors. Why would anyone ever do this?
Yeah, great question. In one sense, I'll start with the simple answer, and then we'll make it messy again. So the simple answer is I think we all operate in life, whether consciously or unconsciously, through cost-benefit analyses. And so for artists, they make a decision. It's the equation that they've put together and all the variables they've put in say, on balance, I'm going to do this rather than that. And that's kind of true for all decisions we make. And yes, there's stress involved in it, but I think the analysis is that it's more than compensated by the joys and meaning and purpose, right? So that's the simple answer. The messy one and the more mysterious one is why do some people choose to go this way and not that? It's, somewhere in this discussion with Robert, he talked about there being two doors. I don't really remember that. And it was his advice to young artists. And he said, if you're at that decision point, follow your interest. Right. And so, and I'm sure that sometimes people don't make the elaborative choice. They don't necessarily make the best choice. They might the ego fears about making a living, or the fear of not being successful, and that being crushing. They decide to go the safer path, but then may carry regret for that, for their for the rest of their life, sort of thing. So it's not like all major life decisions. If it's a real decision, like it's not just a calculation, it's not just plain as day. There's uncertainty, and because you can't know in advance. Mm-hmm. And Robert made some reference to that. He said, "Oh no, it said it's not a formula." Because I think I said to him something along the lines of, "Well, a younger artist might look at you and say it's easy for you to say because it worked out." And he said, no, it's not a formula. But, something I didn't think to say to him when he said that was when major life decisions aren't just about calculating in advance what the most elaborative choice is, like the cost-benefit analysis. That's an important, we should think about and plan and examine and talk to people. But a huge part of making the right decision is what you do after you make the decision. It's like, what are you doing to make it the right decision? And all sorts of things happen in life when you set forth on a journey. There's all kinds of unexpected stuff that happens. It's a bit like being on a plane from Los Angeles to Vancouver with Terry McBride. I did not see that coming. Yeah, so for those who are just listening to this podcast, Terry is now playing a violin. So what was the question again?
It was a very cheeky question. It was, why would you do that with the anxiety exasperated? But I absolutely hear what you're saying, and it's when you bet on yourself, then the mystic or the magic that happens after that, because you're invested in yourself and you are in action, taking the steps to be successful, hopefully successful in what you're doing.
And he talked a lot about this little quiet voice of intuition saying, do this. There are maybe louder voices that, about follow the safer path, or the path where there's more money. But there's also, I think, this sort of inner voice that we don't often quieten down enough and listen to. Mm-hmm. And this is, this brings in the question of the ego. And we had, I think, a fantastic conversation, which I'd like to take up with him again at some time, about the ego's function in keeping us safe. It's an important function, but it often is to our detriment. We don't live in an exceedingly unsafe environment, not like the Stone Age. And so it's often taking us down pathways that actually are maybe not as good for us, and shut off things that actually would be more exciting, more enlivening, certainly more uncertain. The other thing is that I remember, I may have even mentioned this to Robert. One of the authors I interviewed for my doctorate, talked about developing what he called a kind of confidence. And the context was that he wrote his first novel. He said it was excruciatingly difficult to write. He really suffered writing it, and it was really successful. So then he gets a book contract to write 2 or 3 more, and he's terrified, But naively, he kind of thought, well, probably the second book will be easier. And it wasn't. Nor was the third book. And he said to me, they're never... But what's changed is his relationship to his own uncertainty and the ambiguity and so on. Now he's at a meta level more comfortable with the uncertainty. I think this is a really central capability for creativity generally, is forming this different relationship with impasse and uncertainty and ambiguity, that you can actually learn to value it and trust in your processing of it. I think this is a really, really key thing. Yeah, I can just see, there's three other people here with questions, and we're gonna dive deep on all four of these, I suspect, and probably they'll overlap a bit. Yeah, but so what else, folks?
I'll go next if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So
please.
knowing that you're a sensitive artist, I just want to make sure that you're okay and that your use of social media in like promoting these is fine. Just want to get that out there. Just make sure that you're feeling safe.
No, I'm not. I don't feel safe with you, but I feel safe with the protection of the other three people on this.
Got
call.
it. Okay, perfect. Then I'd like you to expand a bit upon fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence and how that informs your intuition.
Yeah, fantastic. So I probably should explain those two terms for people who haven't seen the podcast. So this idea that we're born with quite high levels of what's called fluid intelligence. So this is like the raw computing power of the brain. It's how much grunt the motor has. So, things like processing speed, memory, capacity to process information, So like little kids, that it's at its absolute peak. They're like sponges for knowledge and new things. They remember stuff really well. They can learn multiple languages at that early stage, et cetera, right? So, but it declines, and quite markedly from the sort of 20s onwards, right? There's a real peak in fluid intelligence. It's probably some evolutionary reason for that. And what it is that we're building up an enormous database, what I call with Robert the sort of library of the mind, with millions and millions of books that become really interconnected. They're cross-referenced in a quite sophisticated way in neuronal networks in the brain. And the more and more of these books that you have, or the more data information that you have, when you're experiencing anything in the world, it now is experienced via that network, via that vast constellation. All right? So in other words, we don't just see what's out there, we see it through all of our experience. Mm-hmm. And that's crystallized intelligence. It's crystallized because we're not coming to the world empty now. We're coming to the world through this vast architecture. And we see patterns in the world. I mean, to give it the simplest of examples, baby looking up at the clouds probably doesn't see clouds as we do. They would certainly be seeing patterns of light and colour and shadow and shape and movement. But they certainly wouldn't have the concept of clouds and that they contain water vapour, et cetera, right? But the crystallised intelligence immediately sees not only a cloud, but a type of cloud and whether it's going to rain or not and what that's going to mean. Do I need to water the garden today or take an umbrella, right? And so as you get older and older and older, you've got more of this crystallized intelligence. Now, your question is then the relationship between that and intuition.
And intuition, yes.
Yeah.
Because there's that intellectual part of intuition you almost want to get out of the way because it's the one that fits with the ego and the fear and might lead you to a more conservative and safer path versus where you really want to go, the things that physically excite you, which is what he touched on a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And not as I said to him, not all intuition is helpful. So, for example, the intuitions, like if you look in the modern age, when people say they do their own research, they're not experts in something, but their gut feeling tells them X, Y, Z. Well, I'm less likely to weigh that and to inform my own decisions than someone who's a genuine expert in the field. In other words, they've got a much bigger library of domain relevant knowledge through which they're seeing this event or this thing, right? So there's that sense in which not all intuitions are equal. But there's another sense that you're alluding to, and that is our ego, of course, is pushing us down pathways that it perceives as safer. And it will do that. It will motivate us emotionally and with gut feelings to do that. And so sometimes those types of intuitions aren't that helpful, right? This is trickier now. So, when that author said to me, "You develop a kind of confidence," he was talking about a sort of more intuitive level of understanding what's going on. I'll try to get to it. Whenever we're engaged in anything that is important and complex, in other words, you can't just come up with a pat answer. There's inherent uncertainty. There's a high level of complexity. An artist is trying to write lyrics or compose music, or they're trying to resolve a musical theme, or a strategist in a music company is trying to figure out, how to reconcile two things that don't appear to be reconcilable. Whenever we're trying to, or I'm working with someone therapeutically, and there's a real puzzle about actually how to help them. Intuition in that point is your best guide, right? And so what does that mean? It means that, and Robert referred to this several times, when we quieten down, when we calm the system down, the brain moves into a different mode. It moves into a more meditative, in a general sense, not in the formal sense of meditating, to a more contemplative mode. There are different patterns of activation of the brain, different kinds of brain waves that are active, but we are moving into a more intuitive state where we're getting access to some of that vast architecture, but without having to close it off too quickly. Now, what I think intuition is a kind of visceral emotional feeling. And that then leads to a kind of more conscious insight. So now, why would it be that way? So, for example, I'll give you an example that I once read about a racing driver. Racing drivers have real expertise. They've got a lot of crystallized knowledge about all kinds of situations on a racetrack. So this guy, he was like I can't remember his name, but he was like a Formula One champion. And he was heading towards a corner, and he suddenly had this feeling. It was like a gut feeling that he should brake a lot harder and slow right down than he would normally do for this corner, right? And he did that, and when he navigated the corner, what appeared to him in front of him was carnage. There'd been a major crash. There was debris all over the road. There were cars. And his report later was that if he hadn't have braked in this way, he could well have died. Like, but it certainly would have been very dangerous, right? And I think the news reports at the time reported him saying that that God saved him, like he had some sort of religious beliefs. However, some months later, he woke up in the middle of the night with a kind of aha experience. He had this image that came to him in his mind that as he was approaching that corner, he was looking at one of the stands. He was leading the race. He was looking at the stands with lots of people. The image that came into his mind was all those people were looking that way. They weren't looking at him as the leader of the race. So at this subliminal level, his system understood something's not quite right here. Mm-hmm. The intuition was break. And there are many examples of this. Now, it's only because of his experience and all that crystallized knowledge that feature that should not be expected out of all that array of data alerted his system something's quite wrong here. Right? Because a novice driver like you and I, we'd go around the corner and, yeah. So, intuition is this amazing thing that it does, I think, get better and better the more experienced we become. Now, that's a different example in a sense, like he didn't exactly... I mean, maybe he is, I don't know what racing drivers are, whether they're in some type of flow state and akin to a quietening down. They probably are. But I think there's a necessary connection between crystallized intelligence and intuition in this way. At least intuition that's valuable. Does that help, Terry? Thumbs up. Gee, high praise indeed.
I think the analogy and the example crystallizes. Otherwise, you are going all over the place.
You're such a smarty pants. Okay, Colleen and Chris, who wants to contribute?
I can go.
Thank you.
Mine is just a simple observation. I think that what resonated is his, I don't want to say his age, but his, he has been in the music industry at a time, or he stopped touring at a time when it really shifted a lot, when social media really ramped up and it seems different. It is different for artists, new artists that come up. And I think that the landscape has changed a lot. And I think that he just seemed very measured and very, not relaxed about it, but he had a different experience than new artists would.
Yes.
And, but also has been able to enjoy and to be a part of an industry and a time when it was probably, I wouldn't say less stressful, but he was able to tour at a different level, basically.
Yeah, there's a few things there. I mean, he obviously he got to be quite successful in his own by his own report in touring, but he found it very, very stressful physiologically and psychologically, right? And he made reference quite a few times throughout about being sensitive, and then that led to a discussion about aesthetic creativity. Is often related to that kind of sensitivity amongst other personality features. So he was discovering in that touring aspect that was hard for him. But he then also mentioned, I think he was at the beginning of the sort of social media component, and he used a phrase, I think it was the compare and despair mindset, I think he called it. And I thought, yeah. And I think in our discussion with Roses and Revolutions, Alyssa talked about comparison being the thief of joy as well, So I think maybe he saw the writing on the wall a bit as well, Colleen, and thought, you know what, the touring's hard enough, and then this sort of really having to play the social media game. He thought, so. But
And
I hear.
I had just had a meeting with a band that I have worked with for many, many years, and who were in the industry before all of it, and they were just talking about how grateful they were that they didn't have to experience that. And I just think it's a topic that is going to come up constantly, especially with the political climate and just overuse of all technology. I think people are really, really struggling with it.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, there's a groundswell of things happening generally with youth and social media. As in Australia here, we're putting in place a ban on under 16-year-olds on social media. We'll see how that pans out, of course. But obviously, there's a lot more data now. There's research, and we need to do things. And I think the music industry will be a part of that. I'd imagine your roles as music managers, this is a really, really important dimension on shepherding people and taking care of, especially the younger ones. Because what social media does, it plays directly into our egos. And again, in my discussion with Robert, we talked about the ego as this sort of dynamic creation, this construction that emerges to try to keep us safe. And for human beings, being safe is largely being socially connected, being socially valued, part of the village, having some measure of status, which is a direct, from a visceral nervous system point of view, suggests to us, I will survive. And losing that status, being critiqued publicly, has this kind of existential level feeling of dread attached to it. And younger people, naturally enough, they haven't formed a robust enough sense of self yet. It's still pretty fluid. Some of us never get there. I think you're right. The older musicians are probably going, phew, I dodged that bullet. Right. I think the management of this is very, very important, just as it is for our children. But I think all through the 20s, we're quite vulnerable to this. So maybe all music managers need to get a psych degree.
We needed that before anyway.
That's true. That's true. Which, of course, is how Terry and I met, because we were running programs for music managers, and for good or for ill, that's why I was invited into the program, to provide that component. Because, you're dealing with people who are sensitive, generally. Managers are sensitive. They're drawn to the music. And they're dealing with young people who are sensitive, who are going through massive changes. There's a lot of financial, all those psychosocial factors we talked about, all the uncertainty. And now social media is just taking that to another level. Yeah. That's a great observation, Colleen. Not surprising, of course, Which leaves one Christopher Norwood.
Yeah, I was much like Karen. I was like bouncing around. There was a lot of topics covered in this conversation, and we've kind of explored a few of them here. So I've been able to cross things off of my list as we've been going.
Yes.
But one thread that sort of seemed common and consistent throughout was what I'm just going to kind of call it openness. At one point, he referred to it as sort of like the antenna. And this was the idea being that like the superpower of the artist is having this really sensitive antenna that is just this channel for input that then, it's not necessarily through a direct process of theirs that then is this output of music. And it came up also, when he was talking about the advice that he would give to his younger self, right? Which is that like listen to the voice that's telling you the true thing. But it's sort of, to me, the idea here is like just being open and and trying to remain objective and letting those signals come through. The idea also though that openness is a double-edged sword for an artist because it lets everything in. The good signals that lead to music and also the bad. And so I have a few this stirred up a few questions for me, right? Like even like looking around the world right now where it seems like there's a lot of closed mentalities, right? Where it's like people afraid of breaking down their own walls and taking new input and stimulus to allow them to change their worldviews. But I guess like where I want to go with maybe this question here is looping back to the question or the advice that he had, which is that like follow that kind of inner voice that's always there and telling you, what sort of the true egoless kind of thing the interest is. But like in order to tune that, don't you kind of have to go through the experience in some ways? Right? Like, is part of fine tuning what that voice is saying and what that direction is. Part of that is experiencing the parts that you're like, oh wait, I don't like this, and being able to then categorize that and say, okay, this is a thing that I know now is not for me. And so, I guess it's partly that like, where is that role of the experience that you're going through come in sort of charting that path as an artist or as anybody else in the world?
Fantastic. So let's say there are two things to answer here. One is that thing about the importance of going through the rough experiences. And the other is this tuning in the antenna. I mean, some people, in inverted commas, are blessed with lives where everything's great. They're born with beautifully symmetrical faces, handsome or beautiful, with great bodies, and they're born into a loving family, and there's no discord, and they go to great schools, and they're doing really well. They just never really had any calamity. But you just got to give it time, right? And life will introduce calamity. And I remember when I was young, I met people like this, who were just brought up in very privileged environments. Nice people, but shallow, lacking in dimensionality, right? Not very interesting. They just hadn't lived enough. They hadn't had enough of the kind of experience you're talking about that provides layers and richness and also provides empathy for others and access to the experience of others, right? And of course, that could also be a description of artists who do mind their experiences. So we're not talking about having, serious mental health concerns. We're just talking about being human and allowing oneself to feel and go through things and sort of come out the other side, right? And so just on that point, and then we'll come to the antenna point. The having the experience piece, what allows us to sit with experience to have a different relationship to it, where it doesn't destroy us, where it doesn't drag us down, where we're not afraid of it. So that's That's the maturing and key thing, right? So, Robert talked quite a bit about meditating twice a day. Clearly what he's developed is a kind of way of sitting with experience, but not completely identifying himself with the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to be close enough to it to it's not detached per se, but to observe it, but not completely be carried away by it, and it not to cascade. Right, and because this is a life skill that we all hopefully are developing, and it's not by avoiding experience. Someone once said the only way out is through.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that, yes, the experience piece is absolutely essential to developing wisdom of any kind. You certainly don't do it by trying to suppress or avoid experience. Now, the tuning the antenna. There's a kind of way of being, a kind of way of being with that experience that requires a kind of overarching sense of safety and quietude, right? Because if we're sitting with difficult experiences and our whole body is sort of flooded with stress hormones and that, we're not going to have very many interesting insights, right? The ego will come to the front of the mind, and we'll be shutting things down. So he's discovered, for example, that twice a day is 20 minutes. That's his way of just quietening the system down, tuning the antenna, as it were, so that it can pick up the more subtle things, the more nuanced things. Now, you mentioned the problems we're having in the world, particularly, presumably talking about people who've got very polarized points of view, and they don't want to surrender at all their view because they feel unsafe if they do. Right? That any measure of complexity brought into the conversation is experienced as very threatening. Right? It's either I have my entire view or I lose it entirely. And so the answer to that, the answer in inverted commas, is to create psychological safety with those people in our conversations with those people, so they don't feel like they're under attack. That you are allowed to start to have differences in view without being in danger interpersonally, right? But the further we retreat into more increasingly solid and immovable views, the more threatening it feels. It's like we're staking our whole identity on those views, and if the views fall over, then the identity falls over, right? So I guess this is another topic that you didn't ask about, and that's the issue of identity, which is another way of talking about ego. And so naturally the conversation with Robert then moved to egolessness. And this is sort of, again, that I can be more of a space of awareness rather than a separate identity and ego who's constructing beliefs. Yeah. It's more like I'm this location that I can observe reality, and that's a very different relationship to experience than one that is just projecting a view onto reality. It's a bit like if you think, in American sense, if you think about if you're a Democrat and you're thinking about a Republican voter, that's just going to bring to mind a pretty fixed view about the type of person who might be a Republican voter, and vice versa. And if you're then trying to have a dialogue between two people who've got these very fixed view of the other person, it's probably not going to go well. Yeah. So two things there. You have to have the experience, but have a different relationship to the experience. And what really helps in that is this softening and quietening, so that the antenna can pick up more nuance, more subtlety, and maybe put together a more complex story that can reconcile things. Yeah. Because, have a polarized view means you're pushing away all of those inconvenient contradictions and complexities. Yeah.
The way that
you're
the
going.
we have actually have this conversation on one of my teams regularly, and the ethos that we try to put forward is strong opinions changed easily. So the idea being use evidence to come up with a point of view and make sure that that evidence is solid and thoughtful. And at the first moment that new evidence disputes that point of view, take that in, contemplate it, be willing to change your position based around what that new evidence suggests, if that evidence is worth being substantiated.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because if you think about it, it's a meta level. It's basically a kind of philosophic view or a standpoint. It's a meta theory about things. It's saying, okay, here, we all have beliefs and we feel them very strongly. And naturally, when evidence comes up that contradicts them, our first instinct is going to be to deny that evidence. But science and history and experience teaches us that what we ought to do is what you suggested, right? So this is the liberating aspect of knowledge, of science, of what's been learned in meditation over centuries. That we can have a meta theory that carries us beyond our instinctive reaction to contradiction.
I think that the scientific mindset, that always seeking to challenge your beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, science at its best is about, it's based on what's called the null hypothesis. We're constantly looking for reasons that what I believe is wrong. And you've got to get over a high bar before you say, well, that we've got some confidence. There's a confidence interval to believe in this. Even then, it's just a confidence interval. It's not like this is capital T truth. And and you used the word objectivity somewhere there, Chris, as well. And I think this, what we're talking about, is a kind of radical objectivity. Not objectivity like I know what the truth is, or people who try to hit you over the head with objectivity. More like this humility, this openness that Robert was talking to input, to change my structures in response to the perturbations of the system caused by disconfirming evidence, other ways of seeing things, conversations with people who disagree. Yeah. So creativity here it's an everyday phenomenon that comes in families and conversations, and what you do wherever we have to change our mind. Yeah. Well, that's probably not a bad spot to finish. That's wonderful. I knew this was going to be a great conversation, because the conversation with Robert was so fantastic, and listening through it again, I thought, oh my gosh, that was really good. And I will have to figure out a way of talking to him again, I think. But for now, thank you, my friends. You did not disappoint. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, go to my website at drchris.life. And please share the podcast with people you like, so they can like it too. And in this podcast, you've also been listening to a very atmospheric, recently released piece of music by Robert called Circle 28.